I spend most of my day, every day, with folks like you, with product management leaders and their teams, hearing about the challenges they have, the problems they're facing, and helping them, sharing research that we've done looking at what high-performing product teams do, sharing with them advice and guidance to help them improve their performance. And there are a lot of topics that we cover, a lot of issues that come up from product teams, like how to better understand your customers, how to manage a product portfolio, how to better price your product, how to work effectively in an agile environment. But roadmaps is the one that comes up that to me is sometimes the most interesting. Because when product teams have problems with their roadmaps, usually the issue is not what's actually in their roadmap. And I tell them the same thing I'm going to tell you here. I cannot tell you what to put in your roadmap. I'm not an expert in your market. I don't know your customers. I don't know your competitors. Hopefully you do. But the challenges that teams have with roadmaps are not about what goes in the roadmap. It's how that roadmap is documented and communicated. And that's really where the crux of the problem is for many of the teams that I work with. You've heard a lot this morning and already this afternoon about all the things you should be doing to get an understanding of your market, understanding of your customers, test things. But if you don't communicate that and document it well and communicate it with the various stakeholders, then your product strategy won't be successful. So I have 4 goals for you for this session today. I want to help make sure you understand why roadmaps lead to confusion and conflict, often because of the way that they're documented, because of the way that what we talk about when we mean a roadmap. Where a roadmap should fit into the broader life cycle. I'm going to share with you 4 key tips, and then the 4th step is actually something for you to do after you leave. My hope is that you're able to apply these principles, probably not later today or tonight, but probably Monday when you get back to the office. So we need to start with a definition of what is a roadmap. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to think about it on your own, and in your head, come up with a definition. You're certainly welcome to close your eyes, given that we're in the middle of the afternoon, that could be dangerous. But think about how you would define a roadmap. I'm guessing there are probably some words that were part of your definition. Maybe something like vision or strategy, like direction or future, or kind of ideas about where the product might go as it continues its life cycle and evolution. When I ask this question to different audiences, I get very different answers. And I don't mean different audiences of product managers, I mean different folks within different areas of the business. So for example, the typical response when I talk to a product manager is something like this, right? The roadmap is a vision of how the product might evolve to meet needs and strategy. Then when I talk to a salesperson, they say that the roadmap is a guarantee and a commitment of exactly what will be delivered. I'm guessing you've experienced this before, right? So this is part of the challenge. Our definitions of roadmaps are different across our different groups we work with. And when you think about it, there's many different ways that a roadmap's used, and that's part of the challenge, right? Just internally, within your own organization, this is not a complete list, but a pretty good sample of all the different ways roadmaps can be used, right? Your engineering team uses it to plan capacity and what technology projects they need to work on. Marketing should be thinking about how is this going to impact our campaigns and what we're going to do when we go to market with this. Sales, as I mentioned, obviously uses it a lot in retaining customers, trying to get new customers, right? There's a whole bunch of different internal audiences that have uses for the roadmap, and you can see slightly different uses. And then we get to your external audiences. And I work mainly with B2B organizations, so we deal a lot with large companies that have partners, that have long-term customers that are making major purchase decisions. So they want to know what's the strategy and the roadmap going forward before we make a purchase decision. Or partners that you have to integrate with, or influencers like analysts. So the problem comes when we have one single roadmap, one slide, one deliverable that we try to use for all these different purposes. So here's just one common example. How many of you have had to present your roadmap to the senior leadership team at your company? Right, okay. So usually that's the vision, right? You want to seem like a competent product manager. You want to seem like You have a vision, you have a sense of where your product's going, so you project the vision and strategy, and maybe you're asking for money, maybe it's part of an annual planning exercise. And then meanwhile, that same roadmap might be used by your sales team to try to entice customers to buy or stay. Right? And this is where we get into conflict, because obviously if they're expecting, as I showed you earlier, a promise of what's going to be delivered, that's not what your roadmap was intended for. So we need to start with a definition of what a roadmap is, and I think sometimes it's easier to talk about what a roadmap is not. Right? I'm just showing a couple examples here. These are all actual scenarios I've encountered. I've seen a lot of teams in the past couple of years start to adopt product management tools or agile planning software, so they think, oh, we'll just press a button to export's great, that's my roadmap. And it's really just a list of all the Jira issues or all the user stories you have. It's not a list of what sales needs to close things that are in the pipeline. I had one product manager I worked with that literally she said, there's a bunch of stuff on the roadmap, and I said, do you really think you can get this delivered? And she said, no, but if it's on the roadmap and then it doesn't get delivered, then it's not my fault, it's development's fault. So there's a whole set of other issues going on there, which we won't talk about today. Maybe the engineering talk, we can talk about that later. And the last one, I'll just point out that I talk to a lot of teams that are using Agile, and I'd say the majority of the clients I work with are in Agile development environments. They say, oh, we don't really need a roadmap because we're Agile. We're moving fast. And again, that's a whole separate fallacy for another day. But the reality is, as I'll show you, regardless of the environment, you're probably going to need a roadmap for some purpose. So let me talk about how we define a roadmap and where we see it fitting into the broader product lifecycle. This is a model we developed that we use with our clients to help them understand a best-in-class process for innovating, for bringing offerings to market, and managing them throughout the lifecycle. It looks at how do you take an idea, get approval and agreement on it, build it, and then launch it and make it successful in the market. You probably have a process like this that you're using in your company. Maybe not this exact one, but something that talks about, incubate, design, build, launch, manage, or something like that. So we're not going to get into the details, but I just want to point out one key difference from a roadmap perspective. We actually have two boxes on here. The boxes represent specific activities and deliverables. We've got two boxes representing roadmap. First is what we call a product roadmap. Product roadmap comes before you actually start building the product, or if you're talking about the next version or next evolution of the product, before you actually start developing it. And we define the product roadmap differently than what we call the future roadmap, which comes in that growth phase. Let me explain the difference. The product roadmap is really a short-term view that is based around what we think we can actually deliver. It's based on a plan for what we believe we can bring to the market, usually in the next 6 to 12 months, with some decent level of certainty. It's not a commitment, it's not a promise, but at that point we should have an idea of what we think the needs are that we're going to fulfill in the market, what market segments we're going after, and what problems we think we're going to solve for customers in the near term. Separately, we need to have a future roadmap. The future roadmap is that vision. When Gibson presented this morning, he talked about that long-term vision for Netflix, right? When they were sending DVDs out by mail in, 2004, 2005, right? There was this long-term vision that we're going to be streaming, we're going to have original content, right? That's part of that future roadmap. The future roadmap is that vision. So I think when I talk to product managers, a lot of times when they think roadmap, they think more of that future vision, whereas sales and marketing and development oftentimes are looking for that more near-term product roadmap. Now, the reality is, as I'll show you in a minute, these are not necessarily two distinct separate deliverables, right? You have an overall roadmap that looks at the entire vision and life cycle for the product. Just the first part of it might be more certain and definite, which is your product roadmap. And then you still have that future roadmap that gives you that vision of the future. The reason that I think this distinction is really important is because then, for those purposes where you do need to share your roadmap with sales, with customers, with partners, you can have a product roadmap that there's a certain level of certainty around, there's a certain level of definition and detail. But you can still also have that future roadmap that's really your roadmap that gives you the vision, and maybe that's shared with a much smaller audience. And it has things on there that are much more speculative, much less certain, but give you that direction for where you want to go in the future. So now that we've defined, or at least how we define what a roadmap is, let's talk about some of the problems we see. This is a safe space. We are all friends here. So we can admit that we have all probably made some of these mistakes. I certainly know I have. Now this is I'd say a typical roadmap. How many of you have created a roadmap that looks something like this at some point in your career? Okay. This is an anonymized, aggregated version of many, many, many roadmaps I've seen. So first, we've got a very specific timeline that, to a salesperson or executive, kind of gives some level of certainty. We're looking at the next 6 months, and this is exactly what's going to happen month by month. Well, maybe we don't actually have that level of certainty. Maybe those are just the dates that were on there, we thought, oh, we have to present that. But in many cases, the timelines presented on roadmaps give a level of certainty that really isn't there. We see a lot that use technology, right? So we're going to upgrade to version 7.6 SP3. I have no idea what that means. There's probably some people in the company that knows what it means, but many of the people that are looking at this roadmap may have no idea. Same with web services. Well, if I ask a developer what a web service is versus a customer versus someone in marketing, I'm going to get very, very different answers. So just saying, oh, we're going to do web services and it starts here and ends there, doesn't really communicate a lot. In fact, it probably raises more questions than it answers. Most roadmaps are organized into what we call swim lanes, right? Think of a pool and you've got the different lanes that you swim in. So this is an example of what I see a lot, which is where roadmaps are organized based on technology. And this makes a lot of sense if you're talking to engineers who think in terms of technology. But if you're talking to a customer, they don't really care about CM4 integration versus a platform reboot, right? They don't even know what those things are. So we're using language that doesn't make sense to our audience. My personal favorite is when we put development timelines on roadmaps that external parties see. When does sales care about what date does sales care about on the roadmap? When it's delivered, right? They don't care when you start. They don't want to know when you start. They just want to know, when is it going to be done? When can I start selling it? Customers want to know, when is it going to be available? So by saying that this project starts in May and ends there, gives a whole lot of detail that people don't care about, and also provides some level of assurance that really isn't there. That assumes that the developers are available to start on that date. That assumes that the project actually takes this long, it doesn't take this long, right? There's a whole bunch of assumptions that go into here that people will make inferences about, that we probably don't want them making those inferences about. It provides this level of certainty that something's going to be released in the middle of June when actually it might be October. I see a lot of roadmaps. I see this less lately, but a lot of times roadmaps are focused on features and design. This came up this morning a little bit, right? We want to focus not necessarily on the technology we're going to deliver or features and functionality, but we want to focus on what problems we're solving, and I'll talk about in a few minutes. And I lied. My favorite part is this part here. The text is really small. That's intentional, right? You usually bury it on the bottom. So for those of you up there, back there that can't see, I'll read you part of it. It says, this roadmap is intended for use as a guideline and for informational purposes only, and represents our current view of the product direction, blah, 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 subject to change without notice, blah, blah, blah. We use an agile development methodology, blah, 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 right? This is the CYA statement. Cover your, I think that translates well to Europe, right? I can guarantee you that when your salespeople present this roadmap, they cover this up or they take this part off the slide. And I can guarantee if you talk to an angry customer who's upset that something wasn't delivered on time, and you tell them, oh, well, there was that box on the roadmap, they don't really care. They're probably going to cancel anyways. Right? So the point here I'm making is that, as I said, I can't tell you what to put on your roadmap because I don't know your customers, I don't know your market. But I can tell you that all this great thinking that you're doing, all this great customer research, all this great strategy work you're doing that goes into creating the roadmap gets completely destroyed if you don't document your roadmap well and present it well and communicate it well. So that's what we're going to talk about. I've got 4 specific pieces of advice. The first is around the time horizon. And by that I mean there's some sort of timeline, right? You saw January, February, March, etc. You can have different views of your roadmap for different audiences and different purposes. And I would advise you to tailor how specific of a timeline you give based on a number of different factors. So for example, do you have a good track record for meeting dates? If you don't put dates on your roadmap. I worked with a company and they said, look, Jeff, we've got a problem. We produce our roadmap and people don't believe that we can actually deliver. And I said, well, what's your track record for delivering on time? They said, pretty bad. I said, well, then I would not expect you to deliver on time, right? So there's no law, there's no product management guru that came down from the mountain with tablets that says, thou must have dates on your roadmap. How important are the dates? Everyone wants to know dates, but is it really a necessity, or is it more just, I'm curious, I asked? Do you have agreement on the roadmap, right? You can use your roadmap for different purposes, for getting discussion and getting input, or for communicating decisions. So if you're in that discussion and input phase, you probably don't want to put dates because your focus is more on getting the ideas out there. Is the roadmap going to change? Are you in a fast-moving environment? Have you already done estimates with your development team? Right? All these different variables depend on how specific we get. And then here I can just show you a couple examples, right? So based on these factors, based on where on these towards the left or right you fit, you might have a different view of your roadmap. So if you think that, if you come out and say, look, we can probably provide a lot of specificity around your time horizon, then great. Then maybe month by month does make sense. But if you really have no idea, if you're all the way on the right side of the slide, then maybe it's just now, soon, and later. And I've seen some people start to do that. And that may be appropriate for some audiences. As a default recommendation I often give people is the 2, 2, and 2 rule, which is 2 quarters, 2 halves, and then 2 years, right? So the time nearest to us, we can probably provide a lot more detail. I hope you know what you're working on this month and this week and maybe next month. And maybe a little bit less detail the quarter after that, and probably a little bit less detail the half a year after that. So that middle option is probably a good default starting point, but certainly based on this, we want to vary that as needed. The second is how we group things, right? So those swim lanes. How we group items communicates something to our audience. If we group based on technology, then they're going to think technology. But if we group on other areas, other factors, then they're going to think about something differently. So there's a bunch of different ways you can group. I'm just going to do a quick overview of these. And these are not, again, the only options, but these are the most common ones I see. So one of the best ways in many cases is to do it based on a problem or a need or a benefit. We heard this, a couple of speakers mentioned this already today, right? Let's talk about problems, not features, right? So for example, the need is we want to help our clients process invoices more quickly or improve their ability to diagnose patients. So if you can talk about, this is really helpful because it forces the whole organization, the whole team to think about how are we helping people with these problems. You also might have specific product strategy objectives. We want to expand into new markets, or we want to decrease our support costs. And let's talk about all the different things we're going to do to support that. So if you have those specific objectives and you're choosing items for your roadmap to meet those objectives, this can be a great way. And it can also make sure that you get alignment from your internal stakeholders around, are these the strategies and the objectives that we want to focus on? If you're using OKRs, as I've seen a lot of people start to use OKRs with their team, this can be a great way of doing it because it helps you reinforce that thinking around your objectives and those key results you're trying to meet. You might be focused on different market segments, right? So we have certain things we're doing for the financial services sector, certain things we're doing for the education sector, or certain things we're doing for specific countries. So if the roadmap is structured around benefits for those specific market segments or geographies, that can be a great way to approach it as well. I've seen a lot of teams start to do this by persona. I worked on a product that we had 2 very distinct and different personas that had very different and sometimes conflicting needs. So we thought about quarter by quarter or release by release, what are we doing for each of our different personas? And if you have items on your roadmap that are going to provide benefit only for one of those specific personas, it makes sense to organize it that way. And it also helps, again, you focus so you're not trying to do a little bit for everything all the time. You can organize it by the different aspects of your product. So for example, what are the things that we're doing for our account information section versus our credit card terminal versus the search section? This is, I'd say, probably it's not as ideal because it's a little more internal facing than customer or external facing. But if you have a large complex product and you have lots of different components, this can be a good way to think about it. Or if you have an internal audience that's very familiar with their product, again, they understand what those differences are, versus showing this to a customer may not make as much sense. If you're trying to do a portfolio roadmap and look at all the different roadmaps across different products, right? We can have different rows that represent different products. This is particularly useful if you have enhancement or a change in one product that will be impacting another one. So when I see teams that have lots of complexity and lots of platforms and shared services and things like that, they oftentimes want to have their roadmap documented this way so they can make sure that, if we're releasing this thing in June, we want to make sure that this other part is delivered in April so we can bring it to market. And then lastly, there are certain situations where you might want to organize your roadmap by technology, right? So what are we doing for the mobile operating system versus what are we doing for a certain platform? This makes a lot of sense to developers, and when you're talking with engineers, this is a good way to do it, and especially if you're trying to align your roadmap with the engineering team. Now, obviously, there are going to be different audiences, and these are going to work differently for different audiences. So this is not to say that you need to have one version of your roadmap and pick one of these. The components that are on your roadmap would be the same, but you might and probably will need to have different views of your roadmap for different audiences. I like to think of it as different views and not different versions, right? Different versions implies that we're actually showing something different to different people. You know, I'm going to show you that we're releasing something in June and you that we're releasing something in July, and that's not what this is about. Think about having kind of a master database of all of the things that you're doing with your product, and then just based on your audience and your purpose, you're going to show different levels of that information. You're going to use these factors to decide how we organize it and what's actually displayed. The third element I've kind of alluded to already, and again, some other speakers this morning talked about it, so this is great reinforcement. We want to focus our roadmaps on benefit and value and not on features as much as possible. A feature describes what something is, right? What is it that we're building? What's the output or the component? But the capability is, well, what does that do? What does that feature provide us? What does it allow the person to do? And the value is, well, what does that mean, right? Why do I care about it? What benefit do I get? So, as an example, instead of saying, we're going to increase our storage capability to 1 terabyte, let's instead say, we're going to solve the problem and allow you to store more legacy data because that helps you fulfill an auditing requirement, right? That's what customers care about. They don't care about how much data they store. They want to make sure we don't get audited, or if we do get audited, we don't go to jail. Instead of talking about, you know, we have a classroom management system and we're going to create some views that give instructors views into what's going on in the class. Well, really, the problem we're trying to solve is we want to give teachers better visibility of how their students are learning and their progress they're making. Or instead of saying, we're going to build a mobile app, well, what problem is the mobile app solving? What value is it providing? The value is that it gives us the ability to access key information while we're outside of the office, and we know that a mobile app is one way to do that. So the other benefit of this is it gives you flexibility, right? If I say we're going to increase capacity to 1 terabyte, and our engineering team works and works and works, and they can only get to 90% of the way there, we've already kind of painted ourselves in a corner. We've already promised a certain level of data storage. But if we say we're focusing on solving the problem of helping you manage audits and not get audited, then it really doesn't matter how much storage we provide as long as it fulfills that requirement. So in choosing the proper level of detail, there's a couple different variables we can look at. Again, just like earlier, right? This is not a either or, a black or white decision. It's a spectrum. And thinking about a number of different dimensions helps you decide how much detail should I share on my roadmap. Do you trust your audience, right? I've seen situations where product managers present their roadmap to a prospect, and then the next day or later that day, a competitor comes in and presents their roadmap, and maybe that roadmap gets shared. Right? So if we're in a situation where we don't necessarily know or trust our audience and how they're going to use that roadmap, we might be a little bit more withholding of information versus if it's our development team that we work with very closely, we can probably share a bit more. How important is that detail? Again, do they really need to know the detail or are they just curious? If a customer's planning a major technology implementation and it's hinging on having one key capability available in your product to make that implementation go well, they probably need to know it. But if they're just asking out of curiosity, we probably don't necessarily need to provide that level of detail. What's the purpose of sharing your roadmap? Are you trying to actually share the status or are you trying to receive input? Most product managers use the roadmap as an outward communication tool. I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking. I'm going to tell you what we're delivering. But the reality is, in many situations, a roadmap can be a great tool for getting input from other stakeholders internally and from your customers as well. So if you haven't decided yet what's in your roadmap or you're trying to get feedback and input, less detail can probably help because it will help enable those conversations. And then lastly, there's one more. Is there internal agreement on your roadmap, right? If you've already had the discussions and everyone's on the same page, that's great. But if not, you probably don't want to present that level of certainty. And then last, how likely is this roadmap to change? Right? Change based on internal factors or external factors. If you're in a very slow-moving market if it's pretty clear what you need to deliver, if it's unlikely that a new competitor is going to come into the market, you can probably be a little more comfortable with more detail. But if it's the exact opposite, then you probably want to be really careful about what you put out there. So again, let's just look at a couple different examples. So a very low level of detail might be, hey, we think we're going to help customers better monitor their health status. Well, maybe in our heads we know exactly what it is that we think we want to build, but we're just not going to share that. Versus we're going to create a micro-sensor embedded shirt that in real time monitors your biometric data. So if we know that and we can say, look, we are pretty certain that that's what's going to happen, that's what we're going to build, there's agreement on it, it's unlikely to change, we might want to share that information. But we also might want to be careful about how much we share, particularly with audiences that are a little bit more customer or market-facing, just because we don't know how this information might get out. So those are the 4 key pieces of advice. Again, I'm not talking about what actually goes in your roadmap, because hopefully you've done the work to understand what customers need and what your strategy and vision is, but taking that information and presenting it well is really important. So let me give you a couple just high-level examples of these principles in action. So here's just an example of the roadmap. Now again, a lot of times people will come and say, can you give me the roadmap template I should use? And if you've been listening, I hope you understand there is no single template, because it's going to change on all these different factors. But as an example, we've got a timeline that looks at quarter, half, and year. We've organized it, in this case, by persona. There's also something really interesting about this roadmap. There's a magic trick in this roadmap. Are you ready for it? Are you ready for it? Yes. All right. There is no law that says your roadmap has to be a static one-page document, right? You can have animation. You can have click-throughs, right? Just like there's no law that says you have to put timelines on it, right? So you can say, look, we're going to have this version of the roadmap that salespeople see or partners see, but then we're going to have this version of the roadmap that I'm the only one who can present it, or only our customer advisory board can present it. And when we present the details of it, we're not listing, here's the 18 bugs we're fixing, or here's the specific features. We're saying, look, what are we doing and why? Right? Now, rather than talking about a Q1 release, we're going to say we're going to focus on compliance, because that's the problem we're solving. And here's what we're going to deliver and why. And you can see as we go out in the future years, right, we have less detail. So we know that exactly what we're going to do in the first quarter of 2020, because there's regulations out there. We know we have to fill this. But sometime in 2022, we're going to focus on graduate education. We don't really know exactly what that means. We just know that that's that vision that we have for the future. So this is one example. Let me just show you quickly another example. This is a more detailed example, right? If I'm talking to my development team, I might organize my roadmap differently. I might organize it the way that they think about it, because they think about the different systems they're working on. They think about, we've got a team that's working on reporting, and a team that's working on search, and a team that's working on administration. Now, when we're working with developers, we have to provide more detail, because often they want to know, what is it we're actually going to build. But it's a good practice to talk about why as well. Most developers I've worked with, when they come into the office, they want to know, why are they coming into the office? What's getting them up in the morning, right? So rather than just saying, here's the 5 features you're going to build, we want to talk about, we're going to do this because we're losing support, or we know that we have customers using third-party tools, so we need to integrate with them. So again, these are just examples of these principles in action. So a couple key takeaways. I think first, make sure that you have agreement on what the definition of a roadmap is, because if you ask 10 people at your company, I guarantee you're going to get 10 different answers. The second is using roadmaps as this way of getting alignment and for gathering feedback. It's not just a one-way communication. You want to have that single source of truth and then have different views of it based on the situation. And make sure you're spending a lot of time. You're spending a lot of time doing research, doing competitive analysis, doing all the work that goes into understanding what goes into your roadmap. You want to make sure that all that hard work is not lost. So that's probably the last piece of takeaway guidance I will give you. All the other speakers have been talking about some great things today and lots of guidance that I think is really relevant. You want to make sure that all that hard work that you do up front to understand the market and give yourself a strategy and a vision, and all the work that you're going to do down the line to actually get that delivered doesn't go wasted, and that's why having a good roadmap is important. So thank you for your time, and enjoy the rest of your day.